The 60 Days That Saved Europe, Part 1. The Empire at the Gates. The old watchman had spent most of his life atop Vienna's walls. For decades, he had watched merchants arrive from distant lands, ambassadors pass through the city gates, and soldiers march off to distant wars before returning years later with gray hair and old scars. Very little surprised him anymore. Then one morning, as dawn broke over the hills outside Vienna, he looked toward the horizon and felt his blood run cold. At first, he thought a storm was approaching. A dark shape stretched across the countryside as far as he could see. But as sunlight slowly illuminated the landscape, he realized it was not a storm at all. It was an army. Thousands upon thousands of tents covered the fields beyond the city. Banners fluttered in the morning wind. Horses grazed across the countryside, and rows of cannons stood ready beside trenches already being dug by engineers. The watchman tightened his grip on the stone wall. Not because he was a coward, but because he understood exactly what he was looking at. History had arrived at Vienna's gates. Before this story ends, kings will gamble their crowns, armies will march across continents, and one of the most dramatic battles in European history will decide the fate of an entire region. But to understand why this moment mattered, we must begin long before the first cannon fired. We must begin with an empire so vast that it stretched across 3 continents, an empire whose armies had crossed deserts, mountains, forests, and kingdoms, an empire that many believed could not be stopped. The Ottoman Empire stood among the greatest powers on earth. Its territories connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. Millions lived under its rule. Its cities were filled with merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and soldiers. Its capital, Constantinople, was one of the most magnificent cities in the world. Ships arrived daily carrying goods from distant lands. Markets overflowed with spices, silk, precious metals, and product from across continents. The empire's rulers commanded enormous wealth, and its armies had earned a reputation that inspired both respect and fear. For generations, Ottoman forces had expanded westward, capturing territories and defeating rivals. Again and again, European rulers watched fortresses fall and borders shift. To many observers, Ottoman expansion seemed unstoppable. Among the men who believed this was Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, ambitious, intelligent, and determined to secure a place among history's greatest figures. He dreamed of a victory that would make his name legendary. Previous commanders had expanded the empire and conquered important cities. Kara Mustafa wanted something even greater. He wanted Vienna. The city was more than just another target. It was a symbol of Habsburg power and one of the most important cities in Central Europe. Capturing it would send shockwaves across the continent. A victory that would secure his reputation forever. Preparations began. Orders spread across the empire. Soldiers gathered from distant provinces. Artillery was assembled. Supply wagons were loaded. Engineers prepared equipment. Messengers carried commands across thousands of miles. Slowly but steadily, one of the largest armies Europe had seen in generations began taking shape. While armies gathered and generals planned campaigns, life inside Vienna continued as it always had. Children played in the streets. Merchants argued over prices in crowded markets. Blacksmiths worked beside glowing furnaces. Church bells marked the passing hours. Travelers arrived, carrying news and stories from distant lands. To most citizens, war still felt far away. Rumors occasionally appeared, but rumors always appeared. Most never became reality. People continued opening their shops each morning. Families celebrated weddings and festivals. Children attended lessons. People planned for the future because they assumed the future would arrive much as it always had. Among Vienna's residents was a young officer named Lucas von Adler. At 24 years old, Lucas believed the future belonged to him. Like many young soldiers, he dreamed of honor, promotion, and adventure. He imagined himself earning glory on distant battlefields and returning home as a celebrated hero. Yet most of his days consisted of routine duties, inspections, training exercises, and paperwork. Sometimes he found himself staring from the city walls, wondering if he would ever witness a truly significant moment in history. One evening, while sharing drinks with fellow officers, he joked that perhaps history had become boring. His friends laughed. One older officer raised his cup and replied, "Be careful what you wish for." Months later, Lucas would remember those words and wish he had listened. As spring turned into summer, reports from the east became increasingly alarming. Messengers arrived carrying troubling news. The Ottoman army was moving. Large numbers of troops had crossed into Hungary. Fortresses were being threatened. Some had already surrendered. Others were preparing for siege. At first, many people dismissed the reports. Rumors often exaggerated reality. But more reports followed. Then more. Then more. Soon it became impossible to ignore. The army was real, and it was enormous. Across Europe, rulers exchanged letters and advisors held urgent meetings. Military commanders studied maps and discussed possibilities. No one knew exactly what Kara Mustafa intended, but many suspected the same thing. Vienna. If the city truly was the target, Europe faced a crisis unlike any seen in decades. Meanwhile, the Ottoman march continued. The army advanced like a moving city. Columns of soldiers stretched across the countryside. Supply wagons rolled endlessly behind them. Engineers traveled with specialized equipment. Cavalry scouts rode ahead, gathering information and securing routes. Villagers watched silently as thousands of soldiers passed through their lands. Some fled, some prayed. Others simply watched in disbelief. Few had ever witnessed such a force. One fortress after another faced impossible choices. Resist and risk destruction, or surrender and survive. Some commanders chose to fight. Others opened their gates. Yet regardless of their decisions, the Ottoman army continued westward. The closer it moved toward Vienna, the more fear spread throughout Europe. Inside the city, life continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Markets remained open and churches remained full. Yet beneath the surface, anxiety was growing. Families discussed contingency plans. Merchants stored supplies. Officials inspected defenses. Citizens whispered about the approaching army. The city could feel something coming, like distant thunder before a storm. One afternoon, Lucas climbed a watchtower overlooking the countryside. Beside him stood an older veteran who had fought in previous campaigns. The veteran stared silently toward the east before speaking. "When I was young, I thought walls made cities safe." Lucas glanced at him and asked, "And now?" The old soldier smiled faintly. "Now, I know cities are protected by the people willing to stand on those walls." Deep down, he knew something was changing. History was moving toward them, and soon every man, woman, and child inside Vienna would be tested. Weeks passed. Then one morning, riders arrived, carrying urgent news. The Ottoman army was close. Very close. Church bells rang throughout the city. Officials rushed through the streets. Military units assembled. The mood changed almost instantly. This was no longer a distant threat. The enemy was coming. Families began storing food. Citizens volunteered to assist with defenses. Laborers strengthened walls and fortifications. Weapons were distributed. Priests led public prayers. For the first time, people truly understood what might happen. Then came a morning nobody would ever forget. The old watchman climbed the wall before sunrise. The air was cool, and the countryside was quiet. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal. Then the first light of dawn spread across the horizon. Thousands of tents appeared, thousands of soldiers, thousands of horses, a sea of banners stretching farther than the eye could see. The Ottoman army had arrived. Below him, the city slowly began waking. People emerged from their homes. Shops opened. Children ran through the streets. Many still had no idea what awaited them beyond the walls. The watchman closed his eyes for a moment because he understood something most people did not. The lives they had known were over. For the next 60 days, Vienna would become the center of one of the greatest struggles in European history. Some would become heroes. Some would become legends. Many would never see another sunrise. As the first Ottoman drums echoed across the fields beyond the city, Lucas climbed the walls and looked upon the vast army before him. For the first time in his life, he felt fear. Not fear for himself, but fear for everyone standing behind him. The Siege of Vienna was about to begin. For a brief moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. Then the earth shook beneath Vienna. A thunderous explosion echoed across the city as a massive stone projectile smashed into the outer defenses. Windows rattled. Birds scattered into the sky. Children screamed. Before anyone could fully process what had happened, another cannon fired. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, the peaceful city that had awakened to church bells and morning markets found itself engulfed by the sounds of war. Smoke drifted across the skyline. Dust filled the air. Stone shattered beneath the relentless bombardment. The Siege of Vienna had begun. Lucas rushed toward the walls alongside hundreds of soldiers. Around him, officers shouted orders while engineers inspected damaged sections of the defenses. Everywhere he looked, people were moving. Some carried weapons. Others carried tools and supplies. Some carried wounded men away from the walls. The city was transforming before his eyes. Only days earlier it had been a center of trade, religion, and everyday life. Now it was becoming a fortress fighting for survival. Beyond the walls, Kara Mustafa watched the bombardment from his command position. The vast Ottoman camp stretched across the countryside like a city of its own. Thousands of tents filled the landscape. Supply wagons moved constantly between positions. Engineers dug trenches while cavalry patrols rode across the surrounding fields. Everything appeared to be unfolding according to plan. The walls would weaken. The defenders would tire. The city would eventually surrender. At least, that was what he believed. Inside Vienna, however, the defenders refused to yield. Every breach was repaired. Every damaged wall was reinforced. Every attack was met with determined resistance. The siege soon settled into a brutal rhythm. Cannons fired throughout the day. Repairs continued throughout the night. Then the cycle began again. Day after day, week after week. The physical destruction was obvious, but the emotional strain was even worse. Among the citizens struggling to survive was a baker named Matthias. Before the siege, his life had been simple. He woke before dawn, prepared bread, served customers, and returned home to his family. Now his world revolved around shortages. Every morning long lines formed outside his bakery. Every morning the flour reserves seemed smaller than the day before. Every morning worried faces stared back at him, silently hoping there would be enough food left for their families. Matthias watched familiar neighbors grow thinner with each passing week. He heard arguments break out over portions of bread. He saw fear spreading through conversations that once revolved around ordinary concerns. The city was slowly beginning to understand what starvation felt like. Nearby, a widow named Anna faced a different challenge. Each night, she cared for several children whose fathers stood upon the walls defending the city. At first, she tried to shield them from reality. She told stories. She sang songs. She distracted them with games and laughter. But children notice more than adults often realize. Every explosion made them jump. Every distant scream made them ask questions. Every day, they asked the same thing. When will it end? Anna never knew how to answer, because she was asking herself the same question. As the weeks passed, exhaustion became Vienna's most dangerous enemy. The defenders slept only a few hours each night. Repairs continued around the clock. Soldiers rotated between the walls in brief periods of rest that never seemed long enough. Many could barely keep their eyes open. Lucas felt years older than he had only a month earlier. His uniform was stained with dirt and smoke. His hands were covered with cuts and bruises. His face looked thinner each time he caught a glimpse of himself. Yet compared to some of the men around him, he considered himself fortunate. Many soldiers had already fallen. Every day, new names disappeared from military records. Every day, families received terrible news. Still, the city endured. Then a new threat emerged. One evening, while inspecting a section of the defenses, Lucas noticed engineers kneeling beside the wall with concerned expressions. They pressed their ears against the ground and listened carefully. At first, he thought nothing of it. Then, one of the engineers stood and quietly spoke a single word. Tunnels. Soon the entire city understood the danger. The Ottomans were digging beneath Vienna. Kara Mustafa's engineers were among the finest in the world. Instead of relying entirely on artillery, they began tunneling beneath the city's defenses. Their objective was simple: reach the foundations, place explosives beneath the walls, destroy the defenses from below. The defenders immediately began digging their own tunnels. What followed was unlike anything Lucas had imagined. Beneath Vienna, a hidden war unfolded in darkness. Men crawled through narrow underground passages lit only by flickering torches. They listened for enemy movement. They searched for signs of digging. Sometimes they could hear the scraping of tools only a few feet away. Sometimes the tunnels unexpectedly intersected. When they did, brutal fighting erupted underground. There was no room for formations or strategy. No room to maneuver. Only darkness, smoke, fear, and desperate combat. Above ground, citizens worried about cannon fire. Below ground, another battle was already raging. Then came the explosion. It happened shortly before dawn. The earth shook so violently that many people believe an earthquake had struck the city. A section of the wall erupted into dust and rubble. Stone blocks crashed to the ground. Within moments, Ottoman soldiers surged toward the breach. Drums thundered across the battlefield. Trumpets echoed through the morning air. The assault had begun. Lucas raced toward the collapsing section alongside hundreds of defenders. What he encountered looked like chaos itself. Dust filled the air. Broken stone covered the ground. Men shouted in multiple languages. Some fought desperately. Others carried wounded comrades to safety. Arrows, musket fire, and flying debris filled the battlefield. Again and again the attackers pushed forward. Again and again the defenders forced them back. The struggle continued for hours. When darkness finally arrived, Vienna still held the breach. But only barely. That night nobody celebrated. Because everyone understood what had happened. The enemy was getting closer. Much closer. Far beyond the walls, Kara Mustafa studied reports late into the night. The siege appeared to be progressing. The defenders were weakening. Food inside the city was becoming scarce. The walls were suffering damage. Many of his officers believed victory was only a matter of time. Kara Mustafa agreed. Vienna seemed exhausted. The city could not endure forever. Yet while Ottoman commanders discussed their inevitable triumph, events elsewhere were beginning to unfold. Messengers raced across Europe carrying urgent letters. Kings received reports from Vienna. Advisors held emergency meetings. Military commanders studied maps and discussed options. The crisis could no longer be ignored. Yet progress remained frustratingly slow. Old rivalries still existed. Political disagreements continued. Distrust lingered between rulers who had spent years competing with one another. While politicians debated, Vienna suffered. Inside the city, food supplies continued shrinking. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Bread became increasingly scarce. Water had to be carefully rationed. Every day seemed to bring worse news. One afternoon, Lucas visited Matthias' bakery. The shelves that had once overflowed with fresh bread now stood nearly empty. Matthias looked exhausted. His face seemed years older than when the siege began. "We'll run out soon," the baker admitted quietly. Lucas nodded. Neither man said anything afterward. Because there was nothing left to say. The city was reaching its limit. Days turned into weeks. The siege entered its second month. Every morning citizens woke expecting disaster. Every evening they wondered if they would survive another night. The walls still stood, but the people behind them were growing weaker. Then, just when hope seemed almost gone, rumors began spreading through Vienna. At first nobody believed them. They sounded too good to be true. A relief army was gathering. Some said it was already marching. Others claimed thousands of soldiers were moving toward Vienna. The stories changed constantly. Most people dismissed them as wishful thinking. False hope could be dangerous. Yet more reports continued arriving. Then more. Then more. Soldiers whispered about it. Citizens discussed it in hushed voices. Even officers began paying attention. Something was happening beyond the city walls. One evening, Lucas climbed the defenses and looked toward the distant hills. The setting sun painted the horizon red. The Ottoman camp stretched endlessly before him. Thousands of tents, thousands of soldiers, thousands of fires burning in the darkness. It seemed impossible that anyone could defeat such a force. And yet the rumors continued. A relief army. A king marching toward Vienna. Help was coming, or so people hoped. As darkness settled across the city, Lucas stood silently upon the wall. For nearly 60 days, Vienna had endured hunger, fear, exhaustion, and death. The city was battered. The walls were damaged. The defenders were exhausted, but they still stood. And somewhere beyond the horizon, armies were moving. Whether they would arrive in time remained unknown. But for the first time since the siege began, hope had returned. The next few days would decide everything. Because beyond the hills surrounding Vienna, one of the most important armies in European history was approaching. And soon, the fate of Vienna, and perhaps all of Europe, would be decided. As rumors spread through Vienna that help might be coming, few people dared to believe them completely. The city had suffered too much. Too many promises had failed. Too many days had passed with nothing but hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Hope had become a dangerous thing. Yet beyond the hills surrounding Vienna, something remarkable was finally taking shape. Across Central Europe, rulers who had spent years distrusting one another were beginning to understand the scale of the crisis. If Vienna fell, nobody knew where the Ottoman advance might stop. Political rivalries suddenly seemed less important than the threat standing before them. Slowly, armies began moving. Messengers raced between cities. Supplies were gathered. Plans were made. And at the center of this effort stood a man whose name would soon become legendary. King John III Sobieski of Poland had spent much of his life on battlefields. He understood warfare, understood leadership, and understood what was at stake. Reports arriving from Vienna painted a grim picture. The city was exhausted. Its defenses were damaged. Its supplies were running low. If help did not arrive soon, the city would almost certainly fall. Sobieski made his decision. His army would march. Across rivers, forests, mountains, and difficult terrain, thousands of soldiers began moving toward Vienna. They came from different regions and spoke different languages. Some had fought together before, others had not, yet all understood the importance of their mission. They were not simply marching toward battle. They were racing against time. Inside Vienna, the siege continued to tighten. Ottoman artillery never truly stopped. Every day, new sections of wall required repairs. Every day, defenders fought to hold positions that seemed increasingly impossible to defend. Food supplies dwindled further. Men who had once been strong now struggled with exhaustion. Children cried from hunger. Entire families wondered whether they would survive another week. Lucas felt the strain more than ever. The young officer who had once dreamed of glory barely recognized himself. Months of siege warfare had changed him. He had seen friends die. He had carried wounded soldiers from collapsing walls. He had watched ordinary citizens display extraordinary courage. The romantic ideas he once held about war had vanished long ago. What remained was determination. One evening, as darkness settled over the city, Lucas climbed the walls and stared toward the distant hills. Beyond the countless enemy campfires, beyond the vast Ottoman camp, lay uncertainty. Somewhere out there, according to rumor, an army was marching. He wanted to believe it. The entire city wanted to believe it. But wanting something to be true did not make it true. The next morning, something changed. Reports began arriving from scouts. Then more reports followed. Then confirmation. An Allied relief force had reached the high ground overlooking Vienna. The army was real. It was close. Excitement spread through the city like wildfire. Church bells rang. Citizens embraced one another. Soldiers who had barely spoken for days suddenly smiled. For the first time in nearly 2 months, Vienna could see a path to survival. Yet survival was not guaranteed. The battle still had to be fought. Kara Mustafa received the same news. His reaction was immediate. The relief army represented a serious threat, but he remained confident. His forces still outnumbered many of their opponents. His siege lines remained intact. Vienna was weakened. The city stood on the edge of collapse. Victory still seemed possible. What followed would become one of the most important battles in European history. The morning of September 12, 1683, dawned cool and clear. As sunlight illuminated the hills surrounding Vienna, soldiers on both sides prepared themselves. Thousands of men checked weapons, adjusted armor, and said silent prayers. Some wrote final letters. Others simply stared toward the battlefield ahead. Lucas climbed the city walls and looked toward the hills. At first he saw only distant movement. Then banners appeared. Then entire formations. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers emerged from the forests and high ground surrounding Vienna. The relief army had arrived. A roar erupted from the city. For nearly 60 days, the people of Vienna had endured bombardment, starvation, fear, and uncertainty. Now they could see salvation standing before them. The battle began. Across the hills overlooking Vienna, Allied forces advanced against Ottoman positions. Muskets fired. Cannons thundered. Infantry formations moved through difficult terrain while cavalry units maneuvered for advantage. The fighting was fierce from the very beginning. Hour after hour, the battle continued. Neither side gave ground easily. The Ottoman army remained powerful and experienced. Its soldiers fought fiercely, determined to protect the gains achieved during the siege. Yet the Allied forces pressed forward relentlessly. As the day progressed, the fighting intensified. Smoke drifted across the battlefield. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valleys. Thousands of men struggled for control of hills, ridges, and strategic positions. From the walls of Vienna, citizens watched nervously. Everything depended upon this battle. Everything. Then came the moment history would never forget. Late in the afternoon, after hours of brutal fighting, a massive cavalry force assembled on the heights overlooking the battlefield. Among them stood some of the most famous warriors in Europe, the Winged Hussars. For generations, they had earned a reputation as elite cavalry. Their armor gleamed beneath the sunlight. Their banners fluttered in the wind. Decorative wings attached to their backs rose above the battlefield, creating a sight unlike anything most soldiers had ever witnessed. Thousands of horsemen prepared themselves. Below them lay the Ottoman lines. Below them lay the battle. Below them lay history. Then the order was given. The charge began. At first the movement seemed slow. Then the riders accelerated. Hundreds became thousands. The thunder of hooves rolled across the landscape. The ground itself seemed to tremble. Down the hillside they came, faster and faster. Thousands of cavalrymen charging together in what would become one of the largest cavalry assaults in history. Ottoman soldiers watched the approaching wave of horsemen. Then impact. The charge struck with devastating force. Defensive lines collapsed. Units broke apart. The battlefield shifted. Momentum that had slowly been building throughout the day suddenly exploded forward. The Allied forces surged. Ottoman formations began retreating. What had appeared uncertain only hours earlier now became increasingly clear. The siege was ending. Victory was slipping from Kara Mustafa's grasp. As evening approached, Ottoman resistance began crumbling. Soldiers withdrew from positions they had fought to hold for weeks. Camp followers gathered belongings. Commanders attempted to restore order. Yet the momentum had become unstoppable. The battle was lost. The siege was over. The Ottoman army began retreating from Vienna. Inside the city, celebrations erupted almost immediately. Church bells rang across Vienna. Citizens filled the streets. Many cried openly. Others embraced family members they thought they might never see again. For 60 days they had lived beneath the shadow of destruction. Now they had survived. Lucas stood atop the walls as darkness settled across the battlefield. Below him lay the remnants of one of the most important battles of the century. The enemy camp that had once seemed endless was beginning to empty. Fires flickered across the landscape. The sounds of battle slowly faded into silence. For the first time in months, Vienna felt peaceful. Yet the significance of what had happened extended far beyond a single city. News of a victory spread rapidly across Europe. Messengers carried reports from kingdom to kingdom. Church bells rang in distant towns. Celebrations erupted in cities that had never seen Vienna's walls. For many people, the victory represented more than military success. It represented proof that even the most powerful armies could be stopped. King John Sobieski became a hero across Europe. Stories of the battle spread far and wide. Artists painted scenes of the victory. Writers recorded accounts of the siege. Generations would remember the dramatic arrival of the relief army and the thunderous charge of the Winged Hussars. For the Ottoman Empire, the defeat marked a turning point. The empire remained powerful, but the failed siege of Vienna signaled the end of its great expansion into Central Europe. The momentum that had carried Ottoman armies westward for generations had finally been halted. For Vienna, however, the meaning was much simpler. The city still stood. Its people still lived. Its future still existed. Years later, long after the walls had been repaired and the scars of war had begun to fade, survivors would tell stories about those 60 days. They would remember the fear, the hunger, the explosions, and the uncertainty. They would remember standing upon the walls, not knowing whether help would ever come. Most of all, they would remember endurance. Because history is often written about kings, generals, and great battles. Yet sometimes history belongs to ordinary people. Bakers who continued working despite shortages. Mothers who comforted frightened children. Soldiers who stood watch through endless nights. Citizens who refused to surrender even when hope seemed lost. The old watchman who had first seen the Ottoman army arrive would live long enough to tell his grandchildren about that summer. He would describe the sea of tents stretching across the horizon. He would describe the fear that gripped the city, and he would describe the moment the bells rang in victory. Because sometimes history is decided not by the size of an empire or the strength of an army. Sometimes history is decided by people who simply refuse to give up. And for 60 unforgettable days, Vienna refused.